Hey everyone, how are you doing? I hope you're having a good start of the new year, 2023. It's been quite an interesting period for myself, trying to restructure a couple of things related to my companies, which is basically just a bunch of administrative work. But before I start today, I have a little question for you. So, let's say you have one thing for 2023. What would be your one thing you would like to learn in this year? So just post it in the comments. Let me know. And I might also be able to help and do videos about that. So that would be really useful to know. So let's see, who do we have here? Mighty Fox, Mark, Damien, Nick, hi. Great that you're here. Thanks for joining. So what I want to do today is go through a couple of your questions that you posted as a comment to the community post. If you have any other questions for me, just post it in the chat and I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. So it's really great to be live again. It's been a while. Normally I would have done this a week earlier, but this time due to the new year, it was a bit chaotic, so I shifted it for a week. Yeah, let's get started. It's quite rainy here actually today. It's really typical Dutch weather, like this, tiny raindrops basically all day long. So I was getting pretty wet when I drove from my house to the studio where I'm now, but fortunately I dried up again. All right, so maybe I want to start with just going through a few of your comments here and see what you'd like to learn about this year. So when I start from the bottom, Pablo says, more videos on AI, please. Yeah, it's kind of interesting that, well, I don't really consider myself like a machine learning expert or a data scientist or something. In fact, I've, pretty limited experience with that. I did, a couple of things with analyzing data and basically toying around with AI, but nothing where I really feel like I could bring that much to the table. And what I've also sort of done over the past year is basically focusing my channel not so much on AI stuff, which, if you're doing a lot of Python content, it's easy to kind of go into that direction. But I decided to, stick to my niche of software design and basically doing videos, giving tips about how to write cleaner software and give some advice on what you can do to keep things manageable. And I think for me, that's a pretty nice niche to be in, because I did a lot of that work in the past and still doing, by the way. But it's also for me quite easy to make videos about that. So I will definitely do more videos on that topic. AI and data science related, I might do a bit more. I'm now working with a few other developers who help me also with preparing some of the code examples for the videos. And some of them have data science, AI, machine learning background. So we might be able to do a couple of more things there. So let's see, other things. I see, Augustin, you want to learn about architecture and design. Yeah, architecture is something I've been planning to do like for a long time. I did a video recently on more GUI architecture, which I think is an interesting topic, and there's definitely more I could do about that because I just really covered the basics. And I think there's just so many things to think about when you're designing GUIs. For example, how do you deal with multiple views? Or how do you deal with the fact that on the one hand you have all the user input and you want to be able to respond to what the user is doing, and on the other hand you have the things that are happening in the background, like fetching data or updating other things, automatically saving things to a file. How do you combine that in a way that leads to clean code? And that's more on an architectural level that you're going to have to think about those things. And I think that's something I would definitely like to do more videos about. So other things, I see Akimbo, you want to land a machine learning engineer position without a degree. Well, I guess that's possible. I mean, there's so much demand for machine learning engineers nowadays that, and also education is only starting to catch up now. I know, for example, here in Utrecht, where I'm based in the Netherlands, it's only recently that really machine learning education programs are basically being founded. So if you don't have a degree in machine learning, it definitely shouldn't have to stop you to find a job like that. So of course, you'll have to do the work yourself. You have to become an expert yourself at those things and learn about all the technologies, but then you can definitely do it. All right, let's see other things. Oh, Bart says, I'd like to learn how to better structure my Python code. Yeah, so that's definitely in my ballpark, obviously. I'm certainly going to do more of those design videos. I really enjoy doing the video on how to write functions. So I might do one on classes, although I'm kind of moving away from classes and using functions wherever possible. I might also want to revisit protocols versus abstract base classes. I did a couple of videos about that, but I think I've learned also a few new things, so that would be nice to cover. And there's a bunch of design patterns and principles that I haven't really talked about that much on the channel. So I think that could also be nice to do a bit more work on that. So a couple of you mentioned that you want to learn more about other programming languages. I see React, TypeScript, Java, Rust. I also seen that in the comments. It's something that I'm continuously struggling with. In essence, I don't really consider my channel a purely Python channel. I think I'd like it to be a bit more than just about Python. That's, focus on software design. And basically you can apply those software design ideas to almost any programming language. Maybe not BASIC or assembly, but lots of the other modern programming language, you can definitely apply those ideas from design. But I'm a bit concerned that if I start doing too many other languages on my YouTube channel, that it's not really going to work that well. But perhaps I should just try that again. In the very beginning, when I just started the channel, I actually had a few videos where I didn't use Python, but I used TypeScript. And, the videos didn't do that well, but they also didn't do badly. So it might be fun, actually, to do a video about Rust or TypeScript or anything. If I were to do a video not on Python, what language would you want me to do this in? Would that be Rust, Java, TypeScript, PHP, C++? Let me know what you would want to see from me. All right, so a couple of other things I see is AWS. Yeah, that's learning about how cloud providers work and how you can work with resources in the cloud. I think that's a really valuable skill to have. I mean, most companies use the cloud in some way or another, and it's really good if you understand a bit of that. Even though you might not be directly involved, it's still good that you know what the concepts are, how your code is going to be deployed in there if you work in a larger team. So definitely cloud architecture is a great thing to learn in the coming year, because that's just going to get more and more and more, obviously. All right, other topics I see is log files. I'm going to do a video about that very soon. By the way, I just recorded one last week. Automated refactoring, yeah, that's also cool. There's this tool, what was it called? Sorcery. It's a nice tool for if you want to use some AI tools to help you refactor your code. Sorcery, it's pretty good. All right, let's see. Some people write, in terms of programming languages, only Python. Yeah, I will definitely do mostly Python on my channel. I'm not going to completely switch to another language. Rust, C++, JavaScript, TypeScript. Yeah, lots of, several people mentioning TypeScript, actually. Yeah, I think next to Python, that's like the other, that's a big area of software development at the moment with all the web-based applications. And obviously TypeScript, React is really popular there. Yeah. All right, let's see. Okay, Davis says, I guess another interesting topic to cover close to design patterns would be things like finite state machines, decision trees, or even behavior trees and code complexity. Yeah, so data structures in principle. I think that's a good topic. I haven't really talked much about data structures in particular, but knowing what kind of data structures there are, what certain data structures are good at, what they're less good at, because that also informs the design of your software. So if you design software and you need things to be performant, easy to access, easy to manage a particular type of data, then the data structure plays a very big role. So that's certainly something that I think could be interesting. Yeah. And Rust, I also see lots of people mentioning Rust, also lots in the comments of my videos. I think that's also a really nice language to spend a bit more time with. I haven't really seriously played around with it yet. But it's sometimes, I wonder about that sometimes, like how long is Python going to be popular as this now? I mean, if you look at many other languages, you have this kind of, curve where a language is getting popular, but then at some point it's being replaced by something else. Although that can take a really long time. And there's, of course, several contenders that want to take on Python. I think Rust is sort of one of them, or Julia is one of them. And these languages try to improve on what Python is doing. Still, the usage is pretty low, especially if you compare it with a hugely popular language like Python. But it's something interesting to keep an eye on. All right, I'm going to move to a couple of questions. Maybe I just start with a few questions in the comment section on YouTube. So I'll start by a question by Guzman. I guess they use virtual environments. Which one do you use? venv, virtualenv, pipenv, other pros and cons of the different options. Yeah, so virtual environments. Also something I haven't really covered at all on the channel. There's one tool that I've been using quite a bit for my projects recently, which is Poetry. And I believe Poetry under the hood uses virtualenv. Now, if you look at some of the other options you mentioned, like venv or pipenv, I think venv is a more, let's say, basic, limited version of virtualenv, and I think pipenv adds some features like a pip file that actually Poetry also adds. But another thing next to Poetry that I've been using a lot is simply Docker. And Docker, of course, also provides a completely isolated environment. I did a video about Docker a while ago, and what I like about Docker is that it also nicely integrates with cloud architectures, whereas with a tool like Poetry, you're sort of duplicating some of that aspect, in particular the isolation. So I'd say for me, Poetry works really great, and I use Docker a lot. I really use Docker a lot. Yeah. Next question by Ashvin. For documentation websites, make docs, and more specifically material for make docs seem like amazing static site generators to me. What's your opinion or experience of these tools? So from a developer point of view, I think these tools are really good. I've used them. Not the material thing for make docs. I'm guessing that's a sort of style system that does material design. I've used make docs a lot in the past in my previous company, and for me that worked pretty well. One of the things that I found hard to deal with, and that's not so much let's say from a developer point of view, but from a company point of view, is that often these documentation help sites, you want non-developers to be able to edit those things. You want a non-developer to be able to add tutorials and help pages and things like that. And that's a bit harder with tools like this because, well, they're going to have to learn Markdown. They're going to have to learn how to access the files, the places where they should update this. To me, that was one of the main disadvantages of a tool like MakeDocs. And it's why we basically switched at some point to, let's say, a web-based service, documentation as a service, and that really simplified things for us because, well, although we didn't have some of the nice things of MakeDocs that are really developer friendly, at least everybody in the company was able to use the tool. And in the end, that's also really important because as developers, you also want to focus on, the parts that are your expertise, and other people are maybe better at writing help pages. And so to me, that worked a lot better. But perhaps there is now, it was a couple of years ago, I don't know how MakeDocs has progressed, or maybe there are other alternatives out there that work better. More questions. I got a question by Matteo, who asks, I've been using protocols quite a lot in my code and wonder where you would recommend placing them. Should they be treated as a normal class and have their own file? Or should they be present in the same file as the caller class? What if the same protocol needs to be defined for more than one class or client? They require the same interface. Do you rewrite the protocol class every time? Yeah, so what I've said in some of my previous videos where I used protocols versus, let's say, something like abstract base classes, is that the way until now that I've looked at it conceptually is that, to me, abstract base classes are part of the inheritance hierarchy, right? If you have an abstract base class, you want to use that, then you need to create a subclass, and then you implement the methods and properties that are in the abstract base class. So it's really through the mechanism of inheritance. And to me, that means that, conceptually speaking, the class belongs to that hierarchy, right? Because it is part of the hierarchy. With protocols, this is slightly different. With protocols, it relies on doc typing. And that means that there is no inheritance relationship. You can still do it with protocols, by the way. It's basically a superset of abstract base classes. As far as I know, there's nothing that you can't do with protocols that you also can't do with abstract base classes. There's no features in abstract base classes that you can't use with protocols. But the thing is that because of doc typing, protocols actually live closer by the area where they're being used to define what the interface is supposed to be. So if you have a function that requires an object of a protocol type, and that type has a couple of different methods, for example, then that type definition belongs to that function because that's what the function expects. It doesn't belong to some inheritance hierarchy because there is no inheritance hierarchy. So ideally, that's also where you want to define it closely to, because that's basically where it belongs. Now, you can actually duplicate these protocols because they're completely independent. And if you have two times the same protocol in your code in different files, that for Python, it doesn't matter. And you can use the same object with the actual implementation in multiple places then, as long as it follows those protocols. Now, of course, you also want to avoid code duplication because of having to copy paste the protocols every time. It's also not really good. And it's also a good practice to try and keep a level of consistency between the different functions and classes and methods that you're using. So if you have, let's say, two separate modules in your code base where both modules are using a customer protocol, then it's a good practice to make sure that the customer protocol is actually the same. And if you duplicate a customer protocol everywhere, that's going to be really hard. So I'd say I prefer to not duplicate protocols if you know that it's going to be used in different places. If it's something that's really specific to that particular function that expects the protocol as an argument, then it can make sense to include it with the function. But if possible, I would put it in a separate file so you can use it in multiple places at once. And then if you change it, it's easier to manage, basically. All right, more questions. Ajay asks, hi Arjan. So you watched the video where I mentioned a couple of books I've been reading. I really enjoyed The Programmer's Brain, Principles, The Elephant in the Brain, Clean Code books. Have you been reading any other interesting books lately? Yeah, so I actually already replied in the comments with one book that I think is really nice that I'm reading at the moment, which is called Made to Stick, Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die by Dan and Chip Heath. That one is actually pretty good. Yeah, the interesting thing is I'm not reading that many software development books at the moment because I'm actually, a lot of my time currently is spent trying to wrap my head around how to actually run a business properly. So I'm spending a lot of time reading books about that and trying to learn more and avoid making some of the mistakes. Well, some of them I already made, unfortunately, but I'd like to minimize that if possible. So I'm reading a lot of these business management books at the moment. And they're not as bad as you think you are. I mean, I was always a bit critical of them. I thought it was like a whole load of mumbo jumbo, but they actually contain pretty useful information. So for me, that's been pretty helpful. All right, Michael asks, hi RM, I'm considering adopting Fast API, but the fact is it's mainly run by one person. There is a newish Python framework called Starlight that is positioning itself as faster, more fully featured, that has more maintainers for long-term stability. It's looking pretty good as well. Just want to get your thoughts on this. Thanks. Yeah. I've also taken a look at Starlight, and I mean, it's definitely a nice platform, and it builds kind of on the ideas of Fast API. There's a lot of similarities. But for every project, for every open source project that you're using, you always have to kind of look at the balance of different things. So the number of maintainers or how many people run it, that's definitely one area to look at. If it's just one person, then obviously that's a risk. I think a while ago there was even an example of this going horribly wrong in the JavaScript world, where one guy basically got fed up with his node module that he was the only maintainer of, and like lots and lots of projects were using, and he just decided to release a new version which basically broke half of the internet. And that's the danger, right? And Fast API has the potential to be a project like that because it's used quite a lot in the industry. It's one of the most popular API frameworks. I recorded a video last Friday where I go through all the details of how to use Fast API, by the way. So I'm actually kind of still in the middle of that. So the number of maintainers is one thing, but there's more aspects to when you consider open source projects. Like another thing is that because Fast API is already being used by so many people, it has lots of stars on GitHub. Issues are being actively dealt with. There's lots of contributors, right? And that's also something you have to take into account. Like if you're, let's say, a company that relies on, let's say, earning an income from using these types of libraries, which obviously many companies do, then it's also a bit dangerous to start using a framework like Starlight. I mean, nothing against Starlight itself, right? It's a good platform, and it might very well grow to become like a really big platform like Fast API, but we just don't know that yet. And depending on how much risk you want to take with this, that's also something to consider. So for hobby projects or something that is less risky, or maybe a one-time thing that you just use for a month and then you're going to throw away the code again. I mean, then sure, try a new framework, see how it works. It can be a great learning experience. You might even be able to contribute something to the framework by using it. So that's good. But for really production code where lots of users, lots of people rely on it, you have to be really careful with picking the right platform and making sure that that the chance is pretty big that it's going to be there in let's say a year time, because otherwise you're going to have to change out the code, and changing out an API framework for another framework is a lot of work, because you have to basically switch over all of the endpoints, and it's probably going to be a huge pain. So always something to think about. All right, so I'd like to go through a few of your questions in the comments. So question, Arjan, do you use GitHub CoPilot? What do you think of it? Yes, I use it. I actually use it quite a bit. And I was a bit reluctant to do it in the beginning. When it just came out, I had a trial and I tried it out, and I mean it gave me some nice code suggestions, but also I had some concerns about where is the code actually coming from, and is this actually going to be helpful? I basically had to live with it a little to understand how on what level I could actually use it, and I must say it's slowly been growing on me, using this kind of tool. And where I especially notice that it's helpful is if I just need to write like a quick function that does something. Often GitHub CoPilot can suggest perfectly adequate code. And if I need to have it complete some sequence of code, that I have the function name, and then I start writing the code, but then GitHub CoPilot often is able to just write the rest of the function. And then of course you always need to check whether it's really doing what it's supposed to be doing, but it just saves you time basically. So I've been pretty happy with it. I've been using it also for the code examples on the channel basically, and for that it's also been really helpful. So yeah, I like it quite a bit, and I'm quite interested in seeing where it's going in the coming year. Aman asked why an interviewer would take me and not a chatbot, a GPT. Well, I'd say that currently, I mean, chatbot GPT is really cool. I played around with it, did a video about it as well. I think the chat interface is not the ideal interface for software development. I don't want to have to type my questions and then have it generate code that I need to select and copy paste into my editor. I think tools like GitHub CoPilot that more directly integrate into your VS Code environments make more sense to me, because it feels like a more natural extension of your IDE. And that's also how I view these types of tools. So I don't believe that they're going to completely replace developers, at least not in the coming years. And the reason for that is that there's a lot more to software development than just writing code. And of course, ChatGPT can do lots of different things, but also you need somebody to provide it with the right inputs, and you still need somebody to have the overview of everything that you're going to do. And this is not what ChatGPT is optimized for, right? It's optimized to deal with the context that you give it. But still, I think it's a really interesting development, and I think the way to approach it is, it's a helpful tool for developers. That's how I see it, and it's going to help us work faster, come up faster with solutions, perhaps even help us quickly create some tests for our code, so we can basically use that as a tool to do what we do, but do it faster and better. So I don't think an interviewer would not hire you and say, well, I'll just use ChatGPT because somebody is going to have to chat with the chatbot and you need to hire somebody for that. All right, let's see. Damien says, understand that Python was built on C and can be extended. I've yet to really come across any layman's terms examples of it. Yeah, I haven't done a lot of content on that level either. Yeah, in principle, Python has a mechanism of binding. So you can have, let's say, in Windows a DLL, which is, let's say, compiled C code. And then there is a way that Python actually calls that compiled C code, and then you have a part of your application that's running in C, and that's then very performant. A package like NumPy uses this, right? So the NumPy array is basically a C array, and you access that through bindings, and then you still have the, let's say, performance advantage of C, but you also have the flexibility and the freedom that Python gives you. I might do a video about that in the future. It might be an interesting topic, actually. Let's see. Adat asks, do you know the Anvil framework, Python in front and backend, based on Sculpt? Might be nice to give it some attention. Developing in Anvil is fun and fast. I've not used it, so I will definitely take a note of this and take a look and see if that's something I could cover on the channel in the future. Juan Felipe, what do you think about implementing object-oriented code in data pipelines? I think if you look at a lot of the scripts, and at least the code that I've seen of people that work with processing data, they're mostly relying on existing packages like pandas, for example, and those kind of things. That imposes a certain, let's say, way of working on you, right? You need to follow the data structures and methods, functions that pandas prescribes to you, or any other package that you're using. So in a sense, you sort of have less freedom, and there's also less need because those packages are going to cover a lot of your processing needs. But you still need some way to structure that pipeline for yourself and being able to understand what is actually happening to your data. And that means that on that level, design principles are going to be really important. Now, depending on the package that you're using, the package is going to be more or less object-oriented friendly. And what I mean by that is that some packages will expect you to, let's say, inherit from classes and follow more the object-oriented approach. Pydantic is a good example of that. So Pydantic wants you to inherit from a base model in order to define the actual structures that you're going to use. That's different from, let's say, data classes, which doesn't do that. With data class, you have a decorator, and then you basically define sort of class variables, and then data classes interprets that and adds the correct instance variable. So it's not object-oriented. And that's a very different approach. So depending on the thing that you use, it might make more or less sense to use object-oriented programming. Now, in general, I think in Python, I would be careful with relying too much on object-oriented programming and inheritance, because in many cases that's not even necessary. I think classes, to me, are really useful to structure data and create, let's say, objects with certain instance variables that you can then easily access, for which classes are really helpful. But Python has so many other different data structures that you don't always need classes. And you also don't always need methods. You can do a lot with functions, and even higher order functions, like passing a function to another function or having a function return a function. There's just so many possibilities. And it would be a pity, especially in Python, to kind of limit yourself to the object-oriented paradigm. At least that's what I think about it. AM, how do you recommend to use entity schema interface in Nest.js? I haven't used Nest.js, so I don't know. Is it important for developers to know Docker on a basic level and different stuff in the DevOps world? So I do think it is important to have some knowledge of it. I mean, there is a translation step going from working on your local machine and writing your code and debugging and writing tests until you're convinced that it works. But if you then switch to Docker, I mean, that's going to be a different environment, right? So you need to know what that means. And you need to have at least some knowledge of when your code is being deployed, like how does that happen? How does your code communicate with the outside world? And at that point, it's useful to have at least some knowledge of how cloud architectures work. And in some cases, they can actually help you write code more easily locally on your machine as well. Like Docker, for example, you can run a Docker container locally and then run your code in that. But then, of course, you have to understand how Docker works in order to do that. But it is nice because that means that if you work locally in a Docker image and that setting is then transferred to the cloud, you're going to get the exact same environment. And that's just going to save you a bunch of time. So having some knowledge of that, I think that's really important. And it has helped me a lot in better estimating how complex certain projects are going to be and how much work it's going to be to develop something and deploy that. There's some aspects of the DevOps world that I think are less relevant. I don't think you need to know how, let's say, a Kubernetes cluster works and what all the concepts are in there, because that's really complicated, or how, let's say, the whole cloud authentication security aspects work, because that's really a whole other ball game, and that takes a lot of time for you to learn that properly. I spent basically 3 years trying to get my head around that, and I still don't know everything about it. So that's a really let's say, a deep topic to get into, but having some basic knowledge, yeah, absolutely. Can highly recommend that. Paulo says videos about common use APIs, how to use them, how to navigate the documentation to find and implement what you need. Yeah, it's like we rely a lot on APIs nowadays in most of the code we write, right? The REST API is like one of the most common ways to connect different services, and it's useful to learn about how to use APIs. And also certainly some things that when you want to write your own API, that you should definitely not do. The PayPal API is a very good example of that. I'm thinking of doing a video where I basically go through like a list of things you shouldn't do if you want to develop an API. And I might use the PayPal API as an example. Anyway, Olivier says, hello Arjan, I was wondering if following all the good design principles that you teach here influences the performance of the code. That depends. I'd say sometimes it's going to negatively impact the performance, because if you introduce more abstraction and more layers, that's going to negatively affect the performance. But also design principles and thinking about the design can help simplify your code, because you're going to opt for solutions that are, let's say, less complicated, and that might more directly connect objects via composition instead of inheritance, for example, and then it's actually going to increase the performance. But performance is obviously a whole different area of the code to focus on, right? It's something typically you don't focus on in the beginning of your project. Basically, the way that I've worked with incorporating performance in my designs is that it's something that you do basically near the end of the project. For example, and this actually makes a lot of sense, because in the beginning of the project, you don't know how everything is connected and you don't know where the performance bottlenecks are, unless that's like a really obvious part of your design. But for example, in my company, we're developing a web platform, and well, there's lots of different pages, buttons, navigation, data fetching, and so on. And we didn't spend any time on improving the performance because we simply hadn't clear for ourselves yet how everything is supposed to work. And while you are developing a product, that's going to change. And then spending time on trying to optimize performance while you're still in that stage of fitting everything together and trying to understand what you're actually building and how that's structured is a waste of time. And also when you're working on, let's say, improving your design, then you can at some point slowly start thinking about performance and start making a balance. Like, hey, if we have these two more or less equivalent design decisions at this moment, but this one is going to be more performant than the other, and they're both sort of equivalent, then you can opt for the more performant one. So I'd say the balance shifts in a project. The balance shifts over time. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't follow good design principles and only focus on performance. You should do both. This game, could you roughly explain the difference between Scrum and Kanban? Yeah, so Kanban is, the way that I understand it, is really way more open. And it's basically Trello, right? You have lists and you have things in the lists and you can move things around. You can move the list around. It's more about a way to structure your project, whereas Scrum is a whole development methodology with a Scrum Master and development processes and so on. And Kanban is a lot more open. We've been using a sort of Kanban-like approach in our company. So we use Trello-like structures a lot for lots of the things that we do. We're not doing too many Scrum things like we do a sort of daily stand-up, and because we're a pretty small team, we can kind of keep things a bit more efficient, and we don't need all of those different roles. But basically, that's the way I understand it. Is Scrum is really the full-on development process with everything surrounding it, and Kanban is a more open, simple, flexible version of that. Let's see. All right, so Joseph asks, hi Arjan, thanks for the design. Maybe you already done this, but could you share an example of one of your projects that filled out design guide as a sample? Yeah, basically most of the past things that I did, I took those, that's what I based the design guide on, basically. So that's where I followed those steps. I might be able to do a video where I basically talk about how to start a new project and what are the kind of things to do, how to make, let's say, risk assessments and things like that. I think for me, risk assessment is one of the most important things in starting a new project and doing something that leads to a good result. And what I often try to do is minimize risk as soon as possible. So when you're developing a new project, and you probably need to use, you will have technical challenges, like you need to write a certain algorithm to solve a problem. You will have integration challenges. So for example, you might need to use a user interface library. You will use other libraries to, I don't know, connect to APIs, or you might want to use a library to do parsing, or lots of different possibilities, obviously. And for me, one of the main risks of a project, from a technical point of view at least, I mean there's also other points of views from a technical point of view, for me the risk is mainly in trying to integrate all of those things. Because every library, every package, every platform is going to have its own way of working, because it's been designed in a certain way and you're supposed to use it in a certain way. right? If you're using, let's say, if you're building a React application, I mean, the way that you structure your code is going to be highly dependent on how React works. That's just the way it is. And it's also one of the nice things about those platforms, that they kind of impose that structure on you. And same for a platform like Django, right? If you develop a Django application, well, they're pretty opinionated on how you're supposed to do that and how you're supposed to set that up. So one of the bigger risks in starting a new project is trying to understand how all of those things fit together and if they're actually compatible, and if your choice of technologies is going to lead to problems in the near future. For me, one of the things I typically do when I start a new project is just build some sort of skeleton thingy and just connect everything and just see if I'm able to create something that works kind of. And that doesn't have to do anything meaningful. I just want to check that if I combine all of these different things and patch everything up, that it's actually going to be possible to do the project in that way. And that helps you avoid a lot of risk, because if you wait too long with doing that, then you might end up in a situation where you have to spend a lot of time developing a user interface with a particular platform, but then you realize after a month of work that it's basically incompatible with the backend system that you're using, and that's really problematic, because then you're going to have to start over again and use another platform, and so on and so on. So you want to get that out of the way as soon as possible. And the way I always approach, developing a project and building on it is every time when you want to make that next iteration, because you're really talking about iteratively developing something, think about, okay, what is the highest risk factor at this moment? What has the most potential to completely blow up my project? And that's what you should dive into first. All right. Let's see, B gadgets. I'm watching so much porn that I forgot how to program. Any advice? I want to be a programmer again. I need to drink something for this. Well, what you could do is start a porn site. That's like the best of both worlds. Anyway. Let's see. Deepak, is there any downside of taking pull of Git branch directly for deployment in production? I'm going to need a bit more context for that. Basically, if you look at deployment, what normally happens is that let's say if you're using a service like Bitbucket pipelines or GitHub Actions, that is going to retrieve the latest version of a particular branch. So when that branch changes, then that's basically what you're using to deploy to production. So you'll have one branch that if you push to that branch, that's going to launch the deployment. That's normally how you set that up. So I'm not sure I completely understand your question. Bruno, cheers from Brazil. Cheers from the Netherlands. Brahim, how can I organize my time between... Oh, wait, I'm scrolling down again. Where is it? Too many messages. I need to organize this a bit better. How can I organize my time between job and personal learning? Yeah, you can, some people might recommend you spending all your evenings and weekends on personal projects. I don't think that works all that well. I try to kind of steer, I think what works to sort of steer your job towards being able to incorporate some learning time. And I think actually learning and improving your skills should be part of your job. Because if you learn new skills, it means you become a better employee. And that's a win-win for everybody, basically. So you have to make sure that as part of your job, and that's of course something for you to talk about with your manager, is that you have to make sure that there is space for you to have personal development and not just be like a code writing monkey, right? That being said, it's also interesting. It's also good practice for yourself to do things that are sort of far away from what you're doing in your job, because that's really broadens your horizon and makes you learn wildly faster and wildly more things. So I do think there's always an aspect of things that you're learning outside of your job, and that can be simply a hobby, or that can be you're reading books and things like that. But try to find time as part of your job to do personal learning. That would be my advice. Let's see. Basit asks, is the head-first design pattern helpful for Python developers? So I kind of have to look up what that is. Ooh, I don't know a design pattern. What's going on? Oh, that's okay. That's a book, basically. Yeah. So I haven't looked at this book, so I can't really say. But I think this looks like it has like some overlap with the regular design patterns book. So I might take a better look at this and cover that in a video. I think that makes more sense. Casimir, is it generally bad practice to have business logic in constructors? Yeah, I think it's good to keep constructors kind of lightweight. You don't want creating objects to be really complicated tasks. I think one of the reasons is that you might develop a tendency in your code to create and destroy objects relatively often. Like if you're loading some data and you need to create the objects, then that's going to take time, right? And if you put everything in a constructor, there's no way you can just do something else at the same time. You have to wait until that object is created before you can actually use it. And that means that you're going to run into issues when, for example, you're starting up your application and you're trying to you want things to be efficient. You don't want the user to wait 5 minutes before all the objects are created. You want to have some control over that. So by moving business logic outside of the constructor, you're creating more flexibility for yourself as a developer, because you give yourself more control over how and when certain tasks are being run. And if you put everything in a constructor, that's kind of hard to do. Hi from Senegal, says Modu. Hi from the Netherlands. Is it possible to find a job as a programmer being a foreigner with 2+ years of experience? Will English be enough to work in the Netherlands, or is it compulsory to learn Dutch as well? By Quixie. It's certainly possible. In fact, I think Netherlands is one of the countries where basically almost everybody speaks English. It's partly because we're a small country, so we're used to people not speaking Dutch because we're just too small, so nobody speaks Dutch except maybe some old colonies and things like that. But it means that the environment in the Netherlands is pretty international because we're used to that. There's also some disadvantages to that, by the way. It also means that it can be kind of hard to, let's say, get to know Dutch people and be part of a Dutch friend group, because they're going to switch to Dutch at some point, and then you don't know how to behave yourself, basically. So I'd say you can definitely find a job in Netherlands as a programmer at 2+ years of experience. Yeah, sure. I mean, there's lots of job openings. Although now, of course, with the tech industry kind of crashing a little bit, there is also layoffs like anywhere else. So English is certainly enough. You definitely don't need to learn Dutch. I think most companies even have a culture here where they mostly speak English within the company. Okay, Sami, Python isn't a real programming language. I encourage everyone to learn a real language so that our computers would actually be 100 times faster. So this is an interesting remark. First, what is a real programming language? I don't know. How do you define that, right? Is only programming languages that are compiled to assembly code, are those real programming languages? When does a language become a real programming language? Is there like a cutoff point in terms of performance that is supposed to be the difference? Another thing is that languages have different purposes. So you can have a language that's really performant, but that might also be really hard to use. And then the language might be very performant, but if you just want to write a quick script to get the job done, the language is not a real programming language for you because you can't use it for the problem that you're trying to solve. So I think it's very limited way of thinking that you consider a programming language only in terms of performance, because there's so many other aspects. So I suggest to look at it from a broader point of view and not just look at performance, but look at what you actually want to do with it and then determine which language is suitable. There are no real and fake languages. Every language has a different focus, and we should accept that this is the reality and pick the one that's the most suitable for us. Ankur, hi Arjan, could you please make videos on Python decorators and its use in functional style of programming? Yeah, actually I recorded a video on decorators last Friday, so that's coming out in a couple of weeks. I'm working a bit ahead of time. All right, Konstantin says, could you please share your thoughts on the fact that design patterns, data structures and algorithms are a big thing in the Java C# world, but not so much in Python? Yeah, I think, it depends a bit. I mean, there are very different things, of course, design patterns, data structures and algorithms. I think the argument for design patterns and the lack of design patterns in Python is that Python has much stronger support for a more purely functional approach than C# or Java. I mean, C# and Java, they're purely object-oriented languages, right? I mean, you have some capabilities to, let's say, define function-like objects, but that's still not exactly the same. In the end, everything still needs to be sort of inside of a class. And in a sense, I mean, design patterns are also often a kind of solution to a limitation of object-oriented programming languages. I mean, think of the singleton, which, by the way, is considered an anti-pattern. But the singleton is basically a solution to the problem where you don't want to have to create an object every time you want to use a function, and you want to make sure that there's only one. Basically, it's a sort of rudimentary form of what we would call a module in Python. So it's and design patterns are kind of like that, and in many cases you can actually replace them simply by, I don't know, a function that gets another function as an argument. Take the strategy pattern, for example. It's basically a function that takes another function, the strategy, as an argument. That's all it is, right? So that there is an aspect of design patterns that is really tied to object-oriented programming, and then that doesn't translate too well because in Python we tend to write things that are a bit simpler. We tend to use functions in combination with classes, but we have functions, so we should use them, right? And that means that design patterns in classic sense are not always necessary. Now, there's another aspect of design patterns, which is that they're also helpful in trying to model problems. So, for example, the bridge pattern allows us to have two things that vary and that use each other without being coupled. So that idea is still valid, and that's still useful in Python, even though we might solve it using a functional version of that same pattern. So I wouldn't say that design patterns are, let's say, not used in Python. I'd say that the problem that they're trying to solve, that's still a problem in Python, but you can also solve it differently. Algorithms, I think one thing in Python is that there's such a huge, let's say, collection ecosystem of all kinds of packages that already contain lots of algorithms for, I don't know, search, data processing, mathematics, statistics, etc. That as a Python script writer, you might spend more time figuring out which patterns or which packages you want to use versus actually writing the algorithms yourself. So, but I mean, people still write algorithms. And of course, there's the aspect of performance. Python is not the fastest language out there. So if you really want to write algorithms, you might not want to do that in Python if performance is a thing. Murali, you're from India. Thanks for your content. You're most welcome. Matthäus, best from Poland. What about series concerning graph databases? So I'm assuming you mentioned things like GraphQL. Yeah, I'm really interested in GraphQL. We're using it pretty much exclusively at the moment at our company for designing our backend. I did like a more high-level video about it, but it would be nice to do video in a bit more detail. I think one of the nice things about GraphQL is that you have this idea of resolvers and being able to, let's say, compartmentalize your endpoints in that way and have a bit more control over what data you're retrieving. So I think that's really nice about GraphQL. I think a REST API is simpler for people to use. If you have never used an API, and then having a REST API is like a really easy way to get started. You just have your HTTP request and that's it. GraphQL, you have to learn the GraphQL language first. And of course, GraphQL has some other problems, like that it's sort of hard to model your code in the backend in a way that you're not retrieving, or that you're not doing hundreds of different database requests, but that you're actually efficiently getting the code, and that there's some caching. There's the N+1 problem, which is quite a common issue with GraphQL backends. So those things are things to be aware of. But it's would be nice to do a series about that. Thomas, hi Arjan, would you recommend getting a computer science bachelor degree for someone looking to change careers into software engineering? In the sense that, should you get a university computer science bachelor degree? I think not, to be honest, which is weird because I did that and I taught for 10 years as part of a computer science bachelor. But I think nowadays there are way cheaper options. Like in Netherlands, for example, we have lots of, they call themselves coding schools, which basically offer online courses and online products that allow you to learn coding all on your own. And of course, there's so much content out there on YouTube or on the internet that you can really get quite far without having to do a full 3-year bachelor. I'd say really doing a computer science bachelor degree is a lot of overhead if you just want to get into software engineering, because a computer science bachelor degree will also teach you about, I don't know, graphics and AI and the theory of computer science and complexity. And I'm not saying that all of those things are useless, but if you want to do things efficiently, then those are also things you can do in steps later while you're already working as a software engineer. The only problem is that some companies might be pretty strict in that they require somebody to have at least a computer science bachelor. But I've also noticed that there's a lot of companies that are sort of flexible in this. And if you can show like, hey, I did this course, or hey, I did the software designer mindset from ArjanCodes, then you're actually you can prove that you're able to work in software engineering by doing a skill test, and companies are open to that. Actually, the developer we hired was somebody that didn't have a computer science background, but an electrical engineering background, but we're like a really smart person, and it turned out great. So I think it's good for companies to not stick to labels and boxes. Like if you want a programmer, that needs to be somebody with a computer science degree. All right. Scrolling down a bit. Lee Angle, hi Arjan, I've been developing a GUI application using MVP. What would be a good resource for learning more about multi-window GUI application and dev and passing data between the windows and global state? Yeah, I've not done a lot of really complex desktop applications like that. I've mainly worked on, let's say, the web platforms, where of course you also have lots of different pages and navigation and state and stuff like that. So that's mainly where my own experience is coming from. There's probably still some overlap though in how you set that up and how you deal with state and things like that. But I don't have a particular blog, site, channel that I currently have in my mind that's like, oh, that's all about GUI application. But I might do that myself in a while. So stay tuned. Jishan, how to handle politics at the workplace? Yeah, some people write not get involved. That's indeed my advice as well. It's really, politics generally has more negative effects than that it really solves problems. So I also try to keep away from it, but that's, yeah, sometimes it's not possible. And of course, you need to kind of stand up for yourself, and I see you wrote another message that you're sad to see that more challenging coding work is taken away from you and given to someone else. I think you can provide arguments why that should or shouldn't happen, right? Yeah, it's hard. It's also hard to say anything about it without knowing the context. All right. So Hotjar, so is protocol the same idea as interface in .NET? Well, it is kind of built on a similar idea of interfaces in Java and in C#, but it's slightly different in the sense that the interface in Java and C# is built with static typing in mind, right? And protocols are doc typing, and those things are different. So doc typing means that you only care about the, let's say, the particular subpart of the object that adheres to the protocol, and the rest you don't care about. But you can also inherit from them, which you can't really do with interfaces in Java and C#. You just implement them. So it's sort of related, but protocol is a kind of, I'm not really sure what to call it. A protocol. It's a combination of what an interface is and what an abstract base class is, basically. All right. Vadim asks, what do you think about Python in the front end? I think it's not particularly suited for that. I think there are other platforms that are better. Typically TypeScript, React, Svelte, Vue, those kind of things. They're really more focused on front end. So Python wouldn't be my first choice for picking as a front end development programming language. I would say that it's nice as a backend programming language, especially with tools like FastAPI. But for front end, nah, not really. Mighty Fox, could you do a video about PySpark? Yeah, I'll definitely look into that. That's a good suggestion. Thanks. All right, let's see, what else do we have? Megasham asks, what exactly does a software engineer do in a top company? Oh, that's a good question. BCX has merged pull requests. Yeah, that's definitely part of the job. I mean, it also depends, of course, on what kind of software engineer you are and on what level you're operating. Are you a junior software engineer? Are you a senior software engineer? Are you a lead software engineer? And the bigger the company is, the bigger the development team is, the more, let's say, specific your role is also going to be. So if you work in a startup as the only developer, then you're going to do everything. You know, you're going to do coding, testing, debugging, deployment, DevOps, customer support, right? So that's lots and lots of different tasks. Whereas in really bigger companies, there's going to be way more structure, way more processes, but that means you're also going to be more of a cog in the machine. And then it means that if you're a junior software developer, you might just work on a very specific small area of the application that the company is developing, right? There's more like roles that are less directly involved with writing code, but that are more about, being a Scrum master or a QA, software tester, architect, which is, let's say, more about the overall design. You can be more customer facing, so it depends very much on your role in the company. All right, let's see, what else do we have? Seaburn is also here. Hi, Seaburn. He's a good friend of mine. And we worked together in the past as well. Let's see, what else do we have? Pablo, cheers from Spain. Hey, I started watching your videos this Christmas. It's always good to start watching coding videos during Christmas, and you've inspired me a lot. I'm honored. I'm a beginner, intermediate Python user. Do you recommend any small projects to improve? I'm actually thinking of doing a video about that. Just talking about, okay, what could be nice projects to do when you're kind of do coding as a hobby and you want to learn more, and maybe talk about what type of projects you're going to learn, what type of skill. Try to find something that sort of puts you out of your comfort zone a bit, that has some unknowns in it, because that's how you learn ultimately. So, I don't know, you could create an API for something. There's even, if you want to kind of release it and get people to use it, there's even tools where you can basically publish your API and then people can use it as a part of a whole. So that's nice. Other kind of examples that are fun, I think, especially now with all the machine learning tools out there, I think doing a machine learning project could be really cool. And trying to, get data from an API, do some analysis, do some modeling, and then presenting that data in a nice way so that it provides some insights. I think that's really cool. You could develop a game. Games are also really fun to develop. There's a Pygame, but you can also, keep it a bit more basic and build a lot of the stuff yourself that can be useful to learn. So I think there's loads of those little projects that are really fun. All right. Antonio, say we're using the factory pattern in Python. What would you do if you wanted to, 1, have self-registering subclasses, and 2, keep the factory code and the subclass code in separate files? I've actually built something like that a couple of times. I'm not really sure it has a name as a design pattern. I just call it a registry. And what you basically need next to your factory is, so the factory is responsible for creating the objects of the different types. But you also need something that builds, let's say, another class or another module that allows you to create the pool of, let's say, types, objects that you can create. So, for example, I don't have. It's a bit hard for me to do a full example now, but the idea would be that you have, if you can write a function that creates an object of that particular subclass, then you can basically use a higher order function that you pass that creator function to, and then it stores it, for example, in a dictionary. And then you can then later on, if you want to create the object of that particular type, then the factory would look up which creator function you would need based on a dictionary key, for example, and then call that function. And then that means you can register those functions in the dictionary that create the objects for you, and then the factory just calls them whenever they're needed. So something like this. That's normally how we'll set it up. Let's see. Woedoet for Netherlands, opinion on the coding schools like Codam in Amsterdam, seriously considering enrolling. I don't have experience with that particular coding school. I know a couple of other ones like Codesur, for example, which is also a Dutch coding school. I mean, they have good programs, and I know plenty of people who went through these programs and then got a job as a software developer. It's just slightly less traditional path than going to the university, and also often a lot faster. Another thing is that the way that a lot of these coding school works is that you don't really pay a tuition fee, but they actually charge the employer, the future employer, a fee for hiring somebody from the coding school. And this is actually a smart way of doing it, because as a student you don't have a lot of cash to just pay the coding school, but companies that hire a developer have more money, and they are happy to pay a bit extra on top of the salary if that gives them a good software developer. So that's sort of how the model works. Let's see. Jack, thoughts on the state of the current tech market? Do the layoffs signal a change in tech, or just a cycle and will rebound with the economy? I think it's just a cycle. I don't think this is. I don't think this means that tech jobs are basically gone. I mean, there's just so much software that's being developed, so many tools, so many improvements, so many innovations that I think being in tech, it's still a great place to be. And when things start picking up again, I think there's going to be plenty of jobs. I mean, there's still like so many problems to solve in the world, right? And software is a great way to solve a lot of those problems. I mean, think about the whole climate change thing, and thinking, I mean, there's of course one part of that is, developing technologies to be able to that are more hardware related, like solar panels and batteries and things like that. But there's also a whole area of, let's say, logistics of charging and planning out when to activate certain parts of the grid to make sure that it's not overloaded. And there's loads and loads of things where software play a crucial role, and that's just going to grow immensely. Or even things like car technology, right, like electric cars. So there's just so many areas where we're still at such an early stage that I fully believe that tech is going to play a major role in that, and we need software engineers. All right, let's see some discussion about firmware and microservices. Cute nod. Is it ever too late to start coding or learn to think like a programmer? I first tried coding in university, but felt like everyone already had much more prior experience. Was I too late to start? It's never too late to start. I think a great aspect of learning how to code is that it's really trains your analytical skills, and it makes you look at the world a bit differently. Once you're used to approaching things in a structured way, trying to, cut a problem up in little pieces that make sense, which is a lot of the work of coding actually. I find having training that analytical mindset is really helpful. It helped me solve a lot of problems. Sometimes you may come off as a nerd, but well, you know, that's just life. So we have to accept that's how it is. But it's never too late to start coding, and it's a great skill to work on. It's really helpful in not just being able to write code, but it's going to help you in lots of other areas in your life as well. All right. Bhagwan asks, what do you think about authorization in GraphQL? Yeah, it depends a bit on the framework that you use for authorization. We've been kind of rolling our own authorization system with permissions and roles and things like that. So I haven't used something that's particular from GraphQL. So yeah, I don't know. It's one of the things where I have not yet really gotten a clear view on whether that works well or not. Dennis asks, hi, Arjan, will you be doing any tutorial series on Flask and RESTful interfaces? So Flask, maybe. I am going to do a tutorial on Fast API, and I might also cover a RESTful interface in the future. It's definitely a topic that I'm not going to avoid or something on my channel. Then let's see, what else do we have? Greek the Jimmy, hi Arjan, I've heard many experienced developers criticize object-oriented design patterns, and I've also heard many swear by them. As a beginner, how do I parse who is right or wrong? So design patterns, object-oriented design patterns, they come from mainly the design patterns book that was published in the 90s, basically when Java programming language was kind of at the height of popularity, right? And there was clear reason for the book being published then, because Java and a lot of the other object-oriented programming languages kind of took a next step in how structured programming languages are. But in doing so, they also imposed a lot of limitations on what you could do. For example, in C, you can just write a function and directly allocate some memory and things like that. I mean, Java was one of the first languages to actually add garbage collection and be smarter with memory. But they were also more limited because you couldn't just do memory allocation yourself. There was a very strict model of dealing with objects, and everything was supposed to be in a class with methods, and that's basically how the whole language was designed. And that led to the problem of when you want to design software and you have a more complex setup of classes and objects and things like that, that you really need to think about how things are structured. And design patterns are really helpful for that, obviously, right? Because they're supposed to, each design pattern supposedly solves a class of problems. Now, some of these design patterns are pretty timeless. I would call the strategy pattern or the bridge pattern or the factory pattern pretty timeless design patterns. Others haven't aged so well, like the singleton pattern or the flyweight pattern. I think that's a pattern. I'm not sure I'm using the correct name here, but there's a pattern that tries to split up an object to save memory usage or something, which, well, is a bit fishy, I'd say. So for that reason, I think on the one hand, design patterns are good because they solve classes of problems, but not all of them are good. And also, like I said, it was published in the 90s. and we're in the 2023s now, which is, so these patterns are like almost 30 years old now. So the question really is, should you only look at 30-year-old patterns, or should we take a next step in how we approach structuring our code logically, and maybe think about how we can use the newer features of languages to make our lives easier? And there are lots of new features. I mean, if you look at Python alone, there's things like protocols, decorators, things like that, generators, iterators. So there's lots of those ideas, lots of those things that have been added to the language. And it would be a pity to stick to 30-year-old design patterns. So so that I'd say there's a balance. So I wouldn't say that we can certainly criticize some object-oriented design patterns, but on the other hand, we also have to realize that they've been thought of in a certain period of time in the software industry, and nowadays things are different. So, I mean, it would be silly to criticize a car from the 50s that it's not going fast enough or something. Well, yeah, it's a car from the 50s, so it's not really fair. And I think the same goes for something like object-oriented design patterns. Right, let's see. What else do we have? Bush Leuchte. Hey, Arjan, I tried to build a platform where I manage a number of individual e-commerce shops. What's your pro tip for good architecture? I guess headless is the way. Yeah, it's kind of hard to understand what you mean by managing a number of individual e-commerce shop. Yeah. I mean, are you talking about the user interface? Do you offer like a common user interface for lots of different shops? Or is it more that you want a tool that provides like an admin interface so that you can change settings in each of the shops? It's not really clear what you mean. Maybe you can, if you can post it, I will take another look. Kareka says, Arjan, how can I learn to begin to write tests for my code and write code that can be tested? Yeah, so part of it is actually things like design principles. In particular, thinking about coupling and cohesion. Those things, those are really, you know, if you just want to learn software design, I think those are like the two most important ones, coupling and cohesion. So coupling means that you're trying to minimize the dependencies between the different parts of your code. And that's important, if you want to change things. It's easier because the code is less dependent on other code. But also if you want to test it, it's easier because if code is less dependent on other pieces of code, you can extract that piece of code more easily and put it in a testing environment. So coupling is really important for that. And there are techniques to reduce coupling. For example, dependency injection, and then introducing some layer of abstraction so that you basically provide an object and then in a test you can fake that object and replace it by something else. So coupling. Cohesion is also really important. Cohesion is more about, and I'm kind of using the term maybe not entirely correctly, but it's the way that I like to think about it, is that cohesion is more about how many things does one piece of code do? Does one unit of code do? And it's, as a term, it's been conceived more as part of object-oriented programming and seen more as how many things should a class do. But I also think it applies really well to functions in the sense that you have to think about what are the different things that a function does and what are the responsibilities of the function. And you also want to reduce that, because if a function does too many different things, it also becomes hard to test because you have all these different things that you then need to take care of in that one particular function. And if you split things up more, the things become smaller. As a bonus, you might even get less coupling because there's less needed in these smaller functions, and then they're also easier to test. So those two principles are important. And then how to get started. I think you should start by already applying those principles to, let's say, a small area of your code, and see what can you do to split things out, what can you do to separate things more, and then start writing tests for those things. And initially focus on the things that are easy to test, right? So GUIs, for example, are hard to test. But let's say if you just have a function that generates an ID or something that's pretty independent of the code, that's easy to test. So if you want to learn how to write tests, start with those easy things and then move up and try to think of ways to test the rest of your code base as well. All right, let's see, what else do we have? Maximum comment. What is a good portfolio that I can build to showcase my data engineering and data warehousing skills? Something that recruiters can go through and get an idea of my competencies. Yeah, so I'm not, I'd say, a data scientist or a data expert myself in that sense. I've done, let's say, more general software development things over the past years. So if you want to showcase those skills, I think it might be nice to have at least some project that is sort of accessible anywhere and that you can actually see the results of directly. So I would not just put links to Git repositories and things like that, but I actually would see if you could come up with something that is basically live and that shows something that you've built. Maybe, I don't know, website tracking private jets or something of a famous person. Maybe I shouldn't go there. Anyway. Yeah, Dale writes, it's a real shame that Gang of 4 design patterns have become the only design patterns usually talked about. Yeah, that's kind of, if people think about design patterns, that's kind of what they do, right? But of course, there are so many other patterns that have been created as well. And some build on those patterns, some are completely different. I should probably spend maybe a bit more time in my videos on non-Gang of 4 design patterns. I think that could be a good topic to talk about. Yeah. The other thing, though, is kind of being advocate of the devil here, is that the Gang of 4 design patterns are the most well-known. And one of the advantages of using design patterns is that it's a common language between developers. So if you're using some sort of very esoteric design pattern that nobody else knows about, it might actually hurt readability. But that's that depends on the pattern that you're using. Let's see. Augusto, what do you recommend for a Python application to handle a simple string script that needs to be computed, like myfunc add 10. Yeah. Okay, so you want to have a piece of Python code that runs other code. Yeah, I haven't had lots of experience myself with running eval or things like that. I did something similar in the JavaScript domain, and Node.js has a virtual machine module that allows you to run code in a sandbox. So that's the only thing that I think you need to be careful about with when you're designing these or creating these kind of tools is that it is in a sort of sandbox environment, so that you don't allow for infinite loops and things like that. Especially in Python, this is dangerous because of the global interpreter lock. So if you provide an easy way for somebody to just crash your application, that would obviously be pretty bad. Okay, Bush likes, if you come back to my question, I connect an API to a producer. Every shop has a template front end where, e.g. the color is different. I want to manage them from a single backend. Create, edit, import. I go to a producer, every shop has a template front end. Yeah, we built something kind of like that a couple of years ago, where we were working on a website builder tool for artists, and the idea was that you would have some area where you could actually basically modify the style of things and add different pages, a bit like a sort of Squarespace, but of course way more limited and not designed as well. So I don't think there's a clear architecture that I'm thinking about that can help here, but I mean, it's really important that you like separate the style elements like color and things like that, and so that you're able to run that. Yeah, I don't have a clear idea at the moment to help you. Sorry. Arnab, just want to let you know I really enjoy watching your content. No, I'm so happy about that. Glad to be of service. Keep doing what you're doing. I absolutely will. I'll do only more. Let's see. Where are we? Hadi asks how to deal with, this is a good question, how to deal with senior lead developers in the team who refuse to write maintainable code. And then when you bring it up, they say it works just fine. We can do refactor later. Yeah, the thing is, if you're in, let's say, a hierarchy or a relationship where that person is your manager, of course, you have to be a bit careful. You might be tempted to give very technical arguments for why that's not a good idea, right? You might say, well, if you don't write proper code, then writing tests is going to be harder, and it doesn't look as nice, and this is not compliant with that particular design principle, and that's a very famous computer scientist that proposed that design principle, etc., etc. Those arguments don't really work that well in that case, because the senior developer will have a different priority than writing great code. Right? Writing great code is typically not the most important priority in a company. The priority in a company is to sell the product and make money, and often make profit for the shareholder. Right? So. But you can think of arguments. I mean, there's a reason we try to design clean software. There's a reason we think about these design principles, because ultimately those things are definitely going to pay out. So you can try to use arguments that are more in that vein and saying things like, look, if we don't work on writing at least some level of clean code, it's going to be harder and harder to maintain, and you're going to get this combinatorial explosion of bad code, and that's going to result in a huge mess. And it means in the long term, we're going to have an issue. The other thing is that, in fact, the senior developer might be right, because indeed you can always refactor later. So it's always a balance between writing clean code and sometimes in the practical reality of how things work, you just can't write perfect code. And that's also something you'll have to accept in some cases. I also don't like it, but it is what it is. Let's see. What else do we have? DC, thanks, brother. World is a better place because of you. Oh, that's so kind. Thank you so much. What else do we have? Aldrich asks, hey, any thoughts on using gRPC? Are you planning any videos on that soon? It's in my list. I have like a huge collection of content ideas, and I know gRPC is in there because I definitely want to cover it. So I will do a video about it, but not very soon, but it's on the list. Did you write $1 million question? How do you organize, manage, and share your time? You have a ton going on. Yeah, I know, right? Already running a YouTube channel is like crazy. It's really so much work. You wouldn't think so, but there's just so much going on all the time. Like, we have the basic video, just publishing videos every week. That's already a lot of work because you have to prepare the example, record the video, edit the video, publish the video, do all the metadata, etc., which is really a lot. Then as soon as things start to become, let's say, a bit bigger, like what's happened with my channel, which I'm really honored that it happened, but it also adds a lot of complexity, like you know, your income goes up, but your cost also goes up. So you need to do things like accounting and stuff like that. If you're developing an online course, so I published several online courses in the last year. So that's also something you need to maintain. And of course, I want to make sure that the people that purchase the course, that they're happy. If they have any questions, that I'm there so I can help them. So those aspects also take up a lot of time. And I find like it's always a balance between trying to do new things, because I like to do new things, but also at the same time always being aware of the processes that are ongoing surrounding, in this case, the YouTube channel, and trying to delegate more, trying to automate more and simplify more so that you create the space for yourself to do the next thing. I don't know if that makes sense. But that's where I'm always kind of fighting with how it works. Martin, tips for transitioning from a software developer to a more managerial role, such as engineering manager. So I think what might work well is try to get your foot in the door in some of the decisions that are being taken and trying to carve out, let's say, an advisory role for yourself. And then, when you show that you're able to, let's say, add to the conversation, add to the discussion, then management might also create more room for you to be part of it and to change your role. Another thing is, but that's more from a personal learning perspective, that I think it's really helpful to read books about managing teams, about developing and designing products if you want to go more into the design direction. And there's just so many things you can learn about that and that you can apply right away to what you're doing as well. Let's see, what else do we have? Bashir asks, what is the best way to handle SQLite connections in a multi-threaded app? Should I use a singleton-like pattern or make a new connection every time? So if you have a multi-threaded app, Python is not really multi-threaded, but you might also be talking about other languages than Python. I'm not entirely sure. Singleton, I don't think that's really needed, because that basically in Python would mean that you would have a module where you would have the SQLite connection. So there is a couple of design paths you can think of using, like I think there's a connection pool, a design pattern that keeps open a limited number of connections and you acquire and release the connection. I would look into things like that if you want to keep things manageable and you have lots and lots of different threads. Let's see, what else do we have? So Yevan asked, do you plan to add more about fast APIs? Yeah, so there is a video coming out in, I'd say 3-4 weeks, something like that, where I'm going to cover fast API in detail. And I might do more content about it because I think it's a nice platform. Ivan, how many sources of income do you have and what's their ratio? Hope not too personal. Yeah, so from I haven't really shared, like, I know there are some YouTubers that like share all their finances. Now, I'm not particularly feel the need to be secretive about it. But I'm not sure doing an entire video about that is going to be interesting for you. But let's say, roughly speaking, if you look at the size of the channel, so there's different income streams that are associated with my channel, right? There is the YouTube ads, basically, which consist of, again, different things, because there is the regular ads, there is also YouTube Premium, there are some other smaller things like super thanks or super chats or things like that. So that together is basically one income stream. Then there's on YouTube also memberships, but that's like really tiny. Doesn't really amount to much at all. Then you have affiliate links. So let's say if I do a video about the MacBook Pro, for example, I could include a link to an Amazon page where you can buy a MacBook Pro, and that gives me a commission. Affiliates is also really, really minimal, I'd say, because I'm not a product review channel, right? So affiliate income really works better for product review channels, which have lots of products, which I don't have. Then we have sponsorships. So this video is sponsored by insert company name. Now, I did a few of those. I'm really careful with sponsorship nowadays. I do it maybe once a month, even less, I'd say, over the past year. And I also tend to only do it for companies where I feel like either I'm actually using the product. Like, for example, I did a sponsorship about Notion a while ago already, which I use a lot. I did a sponsorship with Pulumi, which I'm also actually using. So for me, that feels natural, right? Those kind of sponsorships. But again, because I do it in a very limited way, I don't view sponsorships as my main source of income. I don't want that to be too many sponsorships, because I think you're already seeing way too many ads. So I want to limit that exposure also on my channel. But I'd say that's, I don't know, it's maybe 5% of the revenue that the ArjanCodes company makes. And I would say YouTube ad revenue is about maybe 10%, 20, 15, something like that. So the main source of income for me at the moment is actually the online course that I sell. And to me, that also feels natural, because that's kind of my online course is sort of a natural extension of what I do on YouTube. So that's just, more content, exercises, quizzes, everything. I don't want to turn this into a sales pitch, but basically for me, that feels like a very natural way to do things, because the online course is basically, directly linked to what I do on YouTube, and that provides, I'd say, about 80% of the income that I make every month. And if you pull all of that together, that allows me to basically pay my own salary, my own costs, and also pay an employee, cover the software cost. I'm like using 15, 20 different platforms and tools for, music, art, accounting, lots and lots of different things. So all that together, plus I have freelancers that I use, like a video editor or somebody to help out with, code examples or things like that. So all of that together kind of covers the revenue I get from the channel, covers those costs. So I'm pretty happy with that. And in the coming year, I would really like to work on, making those courses better and maybe expanding that a bit and see if I can do more of those things, because I really like doing the online courses. So that's that. So those are sort of the income streams in short. Let's see, what else do we have? Yeah, David, what tools do you use to organize ideas and stuff for your channel, Obsidian or else? I'm not using Obsidian because I'm using Notion, and the main reason for that is that I need a way for us to collaborate on the content. I need if somebody's working with me on preparing a video, like a script outline or code example, they need access to the same space. My video editor needs access. The person who's responsible for the marketing and publishing needs access. So there's lots of different people that need access. And to my knowledge, at least the last time when I looked at it, Obsidian was really limited in terms of what you can do in terms of collaborative features. Notion, on the other hand, has very good sharing and permissions options. So I just stuck with that, and it works well, and I don't feel a need currently to switch to Obsidian. So that's, for me, it's the main reason to use Notion. Other than that, we have some communication tools like Microsoft Teams that we're using for everything related to communication on the channel, video conferencing, things like that. Other than that, for organizing ideas, I mean, we really do most of the stuff in Notion. We're not really using any other tools because there's just so many possibilities in there. Let's see, what else do we have? BCS The Rich should sponsor you. Most of your audience are men and we need to shave. I don't need to shave. I stopped shaving, so it would be really weird for me to get sponsored by a shaving company. I've gotten like the most weirdest sponsorship request. And I think 90% of the sponsorship requests I just decline because it's not really relevant. So I did get a few shaving companies actually reach out to me, or a fashion company, which I'm sort of like the least fashionable person on the internet, I think so. I'm not really sure that would be a good match. But yeah, you have to be careful with that. All right, Anil just joined. Are you a Git expert? Do you think it's something you would like to be better at? I have this thing with Git, like I've been using it for years now, but I still feel like a total Git noob, you know? I have a feeling I really should spend more time on trying to understand all the different Git commands and best practices for working with it, and doing things like rebasing and stuff like that, and what it actually all means and how that all fits together. And I feel like I've just still so much to learn on in that area. One way for me to learn that stuff is actually do videos about them, and then people basically criticizing me for explaining things wrong, and then do a follow-up video where I try to do a better job. So I might have to follow that sequence for Git as well. All right. So it's about, what time is it here? It's about 10 p.m. here in the Netherlands, so I'm going to close off for today, so I can still say hi to my wife tonight. I really enjoyed having this chat again with you today, so I'm going to do another live stream in a few weeks, beginning of February. So I try to keep it monthly. I might do more of these live streams in the future as well, maybe do them more frequently, because I really enjoy it. Thank you so much for your interesting questions. It was really great to chat with you today. Have a great evening or morning, day, wherever you're located in the world. And I'll publish a new video on Friday. So hope you watch that. Have a great evening. Thanks for joining. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.